GO Transit, the Greater Toronto Area's regional rail system, is currently undergoing a massive expansion across most of its rail network. The expansion will see two-way all-day service substantially increased on most existing GO train lines. Significant portions of the Lakeshore West, Lakeshore East, Kitchener, Barrie, and Stouffville lines are set to see some electrification and massive service increases. The Milton and Richmond Hill lines, on the other hand, are unfortunately not set to see any significant increases in service as much as the other lines. Also, aside from the Lakeshore East extension to Bowmanville, there are actually no other planned expansions of the network itself. While I do agree that GO Transit should focus on its popular existing lines in its expansion, I believe there are many missed opportunities to improve the network in the Greater Toronto Area. You see, the current map of GO Transit rail lines literally doesn't paint the whole picture of the railway network in the GTA. There are plenty more existing and even abandoned sections of tracks that could potentially see passenger service introduced as either a variation of an existing line or an entirely new line. Looking at the railway map of the existing GO Transit lines running in the GTA, it's obvious that they are centered around one type of commute: suburb to downtown. The lines all converge at Union Station at the heart of downtown Toronto. In fact, according to GO Transit ridership data, about 91% of all GO Train ridership is to and from Union Station alone. This is despite many people not heading to downtown Toronto in the first place. Looking at a 2019 study, and focusing on those commuting from suburbs outside Toronto, it actually turns out that in the morning rush hour, way more people commute to the Toronto suburbs compared to downtown Toronto, despite GO Train services focusing on getting people to downtown Toronto. Consequently, GO Trains remain an unpopular option among those going to the Toronto suburbs. GO Transit's share is even more atrocious for those going from one Toronto suburb to another. For many, the existing GO Train network is not that useful. For example, if I wanted to get from Mississauga to York region, I would either have to take the slower buses avoiding the downtown area, or traveling by train via downtown, which will add travel time and make the trip slow regardless. So, why isn't there GO Transit service on the rest of the lines that you see here? Well, part of the answer lies with freight trains. It's important to understand that the Greater Toronto Area, and as a matter of fact all of Canada, heavily relies on freight trains run by one of two major private companies: Canadian National, or CN for short, and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, or CPKC for short, formerly known as Canadian Pacific. The lines on which these freight trains operate are for the most part owned and heavily utilized by the respective companies, while at the same time, the majority of the GO Transit network has been acquired or built over the years by GO Transit, and those sections are used almost exclusively for passenger services. Both of these freight companies frequently run long and slow freight trains, making it more difficult to run a frequent and reliable passenger service simultaneously over these shared sections of the network. There are also many sections where only freight trains operate, but many of those sections not currently used by GO Transit are only single track. And because some of the freight trains are too long to fit in a siding, any passenger trains using these sections of track would likely have to wait for freight trains frequently, making the hypothetical services on these tracks prone to delays. Also, these freight trains take a considerable amount of fuel and time to get up to speed, and for that reason, the companies would rather avoid stopping or slowing down freight trains for passenger services and run at average speeds lower than passenger trains. For them, every dollar counts, and every time a freight train is stopped or slowed down, that is time and money wasted. For those reasons, freight train and passenger train operations are kept separate as much as possible. However, this isn't always the case, as you'll see in just a moment. CN has a dedicated east-west corridor, mostly through York region, avoiding Toronto, over which all of their freight traffic is directed, rather than passing through downtown Toronto through Union Station. This section is currently used exclusively for freight service. However, for CN trains to get to and from this corridor on the west end, they have to snake across two shared sections. Between Georgetown and Bramley, Kitchener Line passenger trains and CN freight trains share the corridor with a mix of 2 and 3 track sections. The challenge in this section is that on the west end, freight trains are coming from the south and have to get to the north end by the time they reach Bramley. At the same time, GO trains are coming from the north side to or from Kitchener and have to get to the south side by the time they reach Bramley, meaning that this section is prone to conflicts between passenger and freight trains. But this could be solved by building an expensive flyover somewhere along the line, which isn't happening anytime soon. The CN freight trains also share the Lakeshore West segment west of Burlington. However, thankfully, there is less of a chance of conflicts here, as for the most part, freight trains remain on the northern tracks and the Lakeshore West trains remain on the southern tracks west of Burlington. Lastly, the northern part of the Richmond Hill line is also shared with CN freight trains. There is also a level junction for the tracks of the Richmond Hill line across the CN east-west line, meaning that passenger trains are blocking the freight line while crossing. For these reasons, the Richmond Hill line sees limited rush-hour-only service in the peak direction. So far, I've talked about lines shared with CN trains. But what about CPKC freight trains? Well, aside from access to and from Hamilton GO Center, there is actually only one GO train line primarily shared with CPKC freight trains at the moment, the Milton Line. On the subject of the Milton Line, there have long been debates about how GO transit service may be improved on the Milton Line, especially as many residents of Mississauga rely on it, and it's the 4th busiest GO train line in the system. This line currently operates only during rush hours in the peak direction. For a route with such high ridership, this is an embarrassment. So why is it that this line won't be expanded with the GO expansion? Well, for the most part, the answer lies in how differently the freight companies handle passenger trains. Although both freight railways are generally opposed to having increased passenger service taking up capacity on their lines and potentially slowing down their freight trains, CPKC tends to be less tolerant than CN, though to their credit, the few trains that they do allow are more often prioritized over freight trains and more often on time than their CN counterparts. Also, CN has their dedicated east-west line in York Region, meaning that CN freight trains don't have to interact with GO train services as much. CPKC, on the other hand, only has the single east-west main line across Midtown Toronto, over which all of their freight traffic is directed, meaning that the Milton Line GO trains are more likely to conflict with many of their freight trains. The solution is for CPKC freight trains to also be mostly separated from passenger trains, just like what CN did when they constructed their east-west bypass. This is when the missing link comes into play. The missing link is a proposed new railway line linking the dedicated CN line in York Region with the CPKC main line to the west, allowing CPKC trains to bypass Toronto as well. So you may be wondering, why would this line for freight trains only be beneficial to passenger services? There are actually several advantages. The biggest advantage is that this link would leave the existing CPKC main line from Mississauga to Scarborough exclusively for passenger rail service. This means that the Milton Line would immediately get frequent two-way all-day service without being interrupted by freight trains. But there are many other advantages as well. Because the CPKC freight trains would no longer run on not just the Milton Line, but also the Midtown portion, this opens up an opportunity to introduce a new Midtown GO transit line on this section. This section hasn't seen regular passenger service since the 1930s, when trains stopped at North Toronto Station, located on Yonge Street, right beside the Summerhill subway station. This Midtown line, which has been proposed in the past, would now be far more feasible and would especially be beneficial to those commuting to or from the Midtown area and for those that want to avoid the downtown area when getting from one suburb to another. In addition to getting people to and from this area of Toronto, it could also act as a frequent, reliable rapid transit service for people traveling within the Midtown area. With that in mind, here are all of the hypothetical new stations that this line would serve. I could go into detail about each and every new proposed station in this area, but that's not the focus of this video. The Midtown Line can branch out into several existing corridors to the west. There's actually an existing rail link between Kipling and the rest of the Lakeshore West Line. Some of the Midtown Line trains could use this portion to get to Long Branch, where one may transfer to and from the Lakeshore West Line. There's also an existing connecting track between Bloor and Weston, so some Midtown Line trains could theoretically access the Kitchener Line and go up to Bramalea, for example. The remaining Midtown Line trains could go west into Mississauga, where they could terminate and turn around at any point, such as Arundel, which already has a third track to accommodate turning around without interfering with through-running Milton Line trains. Also, because CPKC freight trains would no longer need to run on the north-south section, this is another opportunity for another branch of the Midtown Line serving a previously unserved part of Toronto. Perhaps some services could even go beyond Toronto, all the way to places like Bolton, though this would require considerable infrastructure upgrades to the existing single-track main line heavily used by CPKC freight trains, despite the bypass. So, in total, there are 4 possible branches to the west, and assuming each branch has a minimum frequency of every 30 minutes, that means the core portion through the Midtown would get service at least every 7.5 minutes in each direction. Not bad for a rapid transit service. In the East End, with just a simple new connecting track, the Midtown Line can even be extended further east to Pickering, where connections can be made to and from the Lakeshore East Line. And that's not all. The missing link in the west may also be used by CN freight trains so that they no longer run on the portion of the Kitchener Line between Georgetown and Bramalea. This would mean more frequent and reliable service west of Bramalea Station to major destinations like downtown Brampton, Guelph, and Kitchener. It would also free up enough capacity to increase long-distance services via Kitchener as far as London or Windsor, or even Detroit for that matter. And using the currently abandoned Don Branch, the Richmond Hill Line may also be rerouted to use the segment of the Midtown Line instead of the existing slow and winding tracks in that area. This would improve trip times on the Richmond Hill Line and improve connectivity to and from the Midtown Line. For instance, those from the east side of the Midtown Line would be able to transfer to the Richmond Hill Line to get directly to and from Union Station, and those from the north taking the Richmond Hill Line could transfer to the Midtown Line to go further west. That being said, there are many opportunities to add more stations on the Richmond Hill Line and much of the GO network within the City of Toronto. As to me, it is a shame that the City of Toronto, being the densest part of the GTA, has so few GO stations despite the desperate need for faster public transit and the existing tracks already going to corners of the city that the existing subway network does not reach. Anyways, that alone is a topic for a future video. It's also highly likely that because running CPKC trains through the existing dedicated CN line will require additional tracks to be added to handle the extra trains, GO trains could also be introduced on this line as well, primarily to get people between other parts of the GTA and York region. The trains running on this line could also take the segment through Halton region in the west to connect to destinations like Milton or Hamilton, and to the east, the rest of the way to Pickering, forming a huge ring line around the core of the GTA. This line would also be advantageous for those in Milton needing to go to or from Brampton, who originally only had a direct rail connection to and from Mississauga, thereby requiring transiting through Mississauga to get to Brampton. If CN trains are routed through the missing link, the northern half of the line in Halton region would be dedicated to passenger service only. Possible new stations along the core portion of this line in York region would include the Highway 407 terminal with possible connections to Line 1, and at Unionville Station to connect to and from the Stouffville line. So, in summary, this missing link will benefit the existing Milton and Kitchener lines by substantially freeing up capacity used by freight trains for faster and more frequent GO trains, and the Richmond Hill line by improving coverage and connectivity to and from other lines. It would also allow for at least 2 new lines to be added to the network. The Midtown Line, with several potential branches to the west, would connect Midtown Toronto with the rest of the GTA and provide much improved transit, directly connecting parts of the GTA other than downtown together. For many trips, going through downtown Toronto will no longer be necessary. The York Line would connect York Region and the northern extremities of Toronto to the rest of the GTA and link far-flung parts of the GTA together, and, just like the Midtown Line, would also provide a means of getting around the GTA without going through downtown. These changes would significantly improve coverage and travel times across the GTA, well beyond the existing GO expansion plans, not just for the GO Transit network alone, but even for many of the local transit networks already connected to the rail network. And because much of the infrastructure, aside from new stations, is already there, this would be one of the most cost-effective ways of revolutionizing public transit in the GTA. All levels of government should thus prioritize the missing link and the relevant upgrades, and the public should persuade them to commit to this project. And above all, what's truly missing is a strong vision of better transit for everyone across the GTA, which this project would greatly fulfill. If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Thanks for watching.